The needle moved through linen with practiced silence. In and out, in and out. Georgia's fingers worked by memory now. 20 years of stitching had carved the rhythm into her bones. The sewing room was hot that spring afternoon in 1853. The kind of wet Tennessee heat that made fabric cling to skin. Sunlight filtered through the single window, illuminating dust particles that hung suspended in the air like tiny witnesses. She could hear the family laughing on the veranda outside, the master's voice, deep and satisfied. His wife's lighter tones responded, their children somewhere in the distance, playing a game that involves shrieking and running. Georgia dipped her needle again, but this time, the thread carried something else with it. Something the family would never see coming. Her hands didn't shake. They couldn't afford to. This wasn't rage making her clumsy or desperate. This was something she'd thought about for months, maybe years. Every stitch deliberate. Every pass of the needle a small declaration that she was not what they believed her to be, not invisible, not powerless, not broken. The white cotton shirt in her lap belonged to the master. She knew because she'd mended the same tear in the shoulder seam twice before. He was careless with his clothing, rough in ways only people who'd never had to repair their own things could be. By tomorrow morning, he'd pull this shirt over his head, button it with those thick fingers, and go about his day completely unaware that Georgia had already decided how that day would feel for him. She folded the finished garment with the same care she always did, smoothed the wrinkles, placed it in the basket with the others waiting to be returned to the house. Then she picked up the next piece of dress belonging to the mistress, pale blue with lace at the collar, and began again. I'm curious, who is listening to this right now? Let me know your city in the comments. Georgia wasn't supposed to have a last name that anyone remembered. The historical record barely acknowledges she existed at all. What we know comes from fragments, from the kind of whispered documentation that enslavers tried to bury because it revealed something they couldn't afford to admit. That the people they held in bondage were always watching, always thinking, and sometimes, when the moment was right, always acting. She was a house slave on a plantation in the hills of Tennessee, trusted with the intimate work of maintaining the family's wardrobe, not just washing and mending, but knowing their bodies well enough to anticipate what they'd need before they asked. She knew the master sweated through his undershirts by midday, knew the mistress preferred her morning dresses, loose in the waist, after breakfast, knew the eldest son still tore his trousers, climbing trees even though he was nearly grown. This knowledge wasn't power in any way that mattered legally. She owned nothing, not even the needle in her hand. But it was a kind of intimacy that the family took for granted, and Georgia never forgot. The sewing room where she worked sat at the back of the big house, adjacent to the kitchen but separate enough that she could hear the family's routines without being constantly visible to them. A middle space, not quite inside their world, not quite outside it. From her window, she could see the quarters where the field workers lived, rough cabins arranged in rows, visible reminders of the plantation's economy. She could also see the big house's back entrance, where she watched the family come and go, their lives moving in patterns she'd learned to predict down to the hour. Every morning started the same. The mistress would appear around 8, with the day's damaged clothing, a torn hem, a loose button, a stain that needed attention. She'd place the items on the work table without looking at Georgia directly, offer some instruction in a tone that assumed obedience, and leave. Georgia would spend the next hours repairing what had been broken, making invisible what had been marred, ensuring that when the family dressed, they looked like the kind of people who deserved to own other people. She'd been doing this work since she was 12 years old. An old woman named Ruth had taught her, hands guiding hers until the stitches became uniform and small, nearly invisible against the fabric. Ruth had told her, they don't see the work, just the result. That's good. Means you can think while your hands move. Ruth had died 5 years ago. Heart gave out one summer evening, while she was pressing sheets. Georgia found her, slumped over the ironing board, the iron still hot against the linen, a scorch mark spreading like a shadow. No one had mourned Ruth properly. There'd been no service, no gathering. The master had complained about losing a skilled worker. The mistress had worried about who would handle the delicate lace. Georgia had folded Ruth's body into a winding cloth with those same invisible stitches and helped bury her in the plot behind the quarters, where enslaved people were laid to rest without markers. If you're feeling the weight of this, hit that subscribe button. What's coming next is darker than you think. The plantation operated on a fiction of order, everything in its place, everyone knowing their role. The big house stood at the center, white painted and imposing. Surrounded by gardens the enslaved kept manicured. Behind it sprawled the fields cotton and tobacco, worked from dawn until the light failed. The quarters formed their own small community, separate but always under watch, and connecting it all were the house slaves, moving between worlds, carrying food and laundry and messages, invisible bridges holding the system together. Georgia moved through this landscape like a ghost. She was expected to anticipate needs without being told, to appear when summoned and disappear when dismissed, to have no thoughts of her own and certainly no desires that conflicted with the family's comfort. The work was never finished. Even when her hands were still, she was supposed to be ready, waiting for the next task, the next demand, but waiting meant watching, and watching meant learning. She learned that the master's temper flared worst on Thursdays after he'd been to town and returned frustrated about crop prices or politics. She learned that the mistress grew quiet and withdrawn during certain months, disappearing into her room with headaches that no one was allowed to mention. She learned which of the children was cruel for sport and which was simply indifferent, and that indifference could be worse because it was more honest about how little she mattered to them. She also learned where things were kept, the keys to the locked cabinets, the schedule of when the overseer made his rounds, the fact that the family trusted her completely with their clothing because it had never occurred to them that trust could be weaponized. The breaking point wasn't a single moment. It wasn't one specific cruelty she could point to and say, "That was when I decided." It was the accumulation of everything. Every morning waking up to labor that benefited someone else. Every evening ending with exhaustion that no one acknowledged. Every day lived in a body that the law considered property, that could be sold or punished or violated without consequence, without anyone even thinking it was wrong. Georgia had seen others break differently. She'd seen people run, knowing they'd likely be caught and punished brutally as a lesson to everyone else. She'd seen others turn the violence inward, giving up in ways that looked like illness but were really surrender. She'd seen fights and resistance that ended in blood and chains. She chose a different method, one that used the system's own logic against itself. If they wanted to treat her like she was invisible, she'd become invisible in a way they'd never recover from. The poison came from plants that grew wild at the edge of the property. She'd learned their names and properties from Ruth, who'd learned them from her own mother. Knowledge passed down through generations of people who'd needed to understand what the land offered beyond what enslavers intended. Some plants healed, some plants harmed. The trick was knowing which was which and how to prepare them so their properties concentrated rather than dissipated. Georgia gathered what she needed slowly, over weeks, during the small pockets of time when she was sent to collect herbs for the kitchen or allowed to walk to the She dried the leaves and roots in the back corner of the sewing room where no one looked, ground them fine, and tested the powder on a scrap of fabric to see how it absorbed. It worked better than she'd hoped. The poison bound to the fibers, invisible once it dried, stable enough to survive the wearing and washing that would come later, and the human body, warm and slightly damp with sweat, would draw it out slowly through the skin, dose after dose. With every hour the clothing was worn. I want to request you tap that like button. Not for me, but for every voice that never got to speak. The day she completed the work, Tennessee was blooming. Dogwoods white against the green hills, the air thick with the smell of earth and growing things. Inside the sewing room, Georgia worked with the focus of someone completing a task they'd thought about so many times that the doing of it felt almost automatic. She chose carefully. Not every garment. That would be too obvious, too quick. Instead, she selected pieces that would be worn often, but not immediately. The shirt the master preferred for Sunday, the dress the mistress wore to receive visitors, undergarments that touched skin for hours without being seen. She worked the poison into seams and hems, places where friction would release it gradually, stitched it into collars and cuffs, folded it into the fabric of their daily lives. When she finished, she washed her hands 3 times in cold water, cleaned her work table, returned the tools to their places. Everything looked exactly as it always did. The basket of mended clothing sat ready to be collected and returned to the family's wardrobes. The sewing room was tidy and still. Georgia sat in the quiet for a moment, feeling the weight of what she'd done settle around her. Not guilt. She'd moved past that months ago, when she'd first considered this path. Not fear exactly, though she knew what would happen if she was discovered. What she felt was something closer to completion, a task finished, a decision made real. She stood, smoothed her apron, and carried the basket toward the big house. The family received the clothing without comment. Why would they? The work was flawless, as always. The stitches invisible, the fabrics clean and pressed, everything exactly as they expected it to be. The master took his shirts. The mistress took her dresses. They disappeared into their rooms to put things away, and Georgia returned to the sewing room to begin the next day's repairs. The poison worked slowly. That was the design. Nothing sudden enough to raise immediate alarm. Just a growing discomfort that would build over days and weeks, the kind of malaise that could be mistaken for any number of ordinary ailments until it wasn't ordinary anymore, until it was too late to connect the suffering back to its source. Georgia continued her work, mending and washing and stitching, moving through the big house with the same invisible efficiency she'd always shown. And if her eyes lingered sometimes on the family members as they moved through their days wearing what she'd prepared for them, well, no one noticed that either. They never had. The first signs appeared within a week. The master complained of headaches, a persistent ache that wouldn't ease. The mistress developed a rash on her arms that itched and burned. One of the children grew listless, picking at meals, sleeping poorly. The family called for a doctor, who examined them and found nothing obviously wrong. He prescribed rest and tonics, suggested the symptoms might pass with the changing weather. They didn't pass. They worsened. The household began to fracture under the weight of unexplained illness. The master's temper grew shorter. The mistress withdrew further into her rooms. Servants were blamed for inadequate care, for not keeping the house clean enough, for failing at tasks that had nothing to do with why the family was suffering. The doctor was called again and again. He brought different medicines. Nothing helped. Suspicion began to circulate, the way it always does when the natural order breaks down. Had someone cursed them? Was there something wrong with the well water? The food? Had they been exposed to some contagion in town? The questions multiplied, but they all shared the same blind spot. None of them looked at the clothing itself, at the fabric touching their skin, hour after hour, delivering its payload with patient, invisible efficiency. Georgia watched this unraveling from her position at the edge of their world. She saw the fear begin to take root, saw how quickly the illusion of control could dissolve when the body betrayed expectations. The family had believed themselves untouchable, protected by their wealth and power and the legal system that declared them owners of other human beings. But the body didn't care about legal fictions. The body responded to what touched it, what entered it, what slowly poisoned it from the outside in. Whether they ever discovered the truth is lost to history. The records from that plantation are incomplete. and what documentation exists doesn't center George's perspective or fate. What we know is that the act happened, the poisoning was real, the family suffered, and Georgia, for however long her freedom or her life lasted after that spring in 1853, had struck back against the people who'd claimed to own her. The silence in the historical record is its own kind of evidence. Enslavers didn't document their vulnerabilities. They didn't preserve stories about being outwitted or harmed by the people they enslaved, because those stories undermined the fundamental lie that slavery was natural, sustainable, benign. So George's act was either buried deliberately or simply allowed to fade into the gaps. Where most enslaved people's lives ended up remembered by communities who passed stories down orally, but erased from official histories that centered only the enslavers' perspectives. Was Georgia caught? The most likely answer is yes. The consequences for enslaved people, who were even suspected of harming white families, were brutal and public, designed to terrorize everyone else into submission. If Georgia was discovered, she probably died violently, her death used as a lesson, but even that violence couldn't erase what she'd already done. The poison had already worked. The damage was done. The illusion of safety was shattered, or maybe she wasn't caught. Maybe the family never connected their suffering to her hands. Maybe Georgia lived with her secret, carried it through the rest of her days, died eventually without anyone knowing. That possibility is somehow more unsettling. The idea that revenge could be completed, consequences delivered, and the perpetrator could walk away invisible, just as she'd always been. I want to request you share this story, because silence helped bury the truth. The plantation system depended on the belief that enslaved people had no interior lives, no capacity for long-term planning, no ability to strike back in ways that couldn't be immediately detected and punished. George's act shattered that belief. It proved that the people held in bondage were thinking, planning, waiting for opportunities to reclaim some measure of power in a world that had stripped them of everything else. Her method was terrifying precisely because it was so quiet. There was no dramatic confrontation, no moment where she could be stopped. The revenge was embedded in the ordinary routines of daily life, invisible until it was far too late to prevent it. She used the tools of her oppression, the needle, the thread, the intimate access to the family's bodies, and transformed them into weapons. The same hands that were supposed to serve became the hands that harmed. This wasn't about changing the system. Georgia couldn't end slavery. She couldn't free herself, or others, through this one act. But she could make the people who enslaved her suffer. She could turn their assumptions against them. She could prove that trust was a vulnerability, that proximity was dangerous, that invisibility could be weaponized. Other enslaved people would have known. Stories like this didn't stay completely secret within enslaved communities. They circulated as warnings, as inspiration, as proof that resistance was possible, even in the most controlled circumstances. When people heard what Georgia had done, they would have understood the message. We are not powerless. We are watching. We can hurt you. And the enslavers would have understood something too, even if they never admitted it openly. They would have looked at the people who served them and felt, maybe for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty. The house slave who prepared their food, could she be trusted? The man who groomed their horses, was he planning something? The woman who rocked her children to sleep, what was she thinking behind that blank expression they'd taught her to wear? Georgia had sown doubt into the fabric of the plantation system, and that doubt couldn't be extracted any more easily than the poison in the clothing. The legacy of her act extends beyond that single household in Tennessee. It joins a long, often hidden record of enslaved people who resisted in ways that official history tried to erase. People who poisoned food, who set fires, who sabotaged equipment, who ran away, who fought back, who found any means available to assert that they were human beings with wills of their own, not the property their enslavers claimed them to be. These acts didn't end slavery. That required war and political transformation, an ongoing struggle that continues to this day. But they mattered. They disrupted the system's smooth functioning. They created fear and uncertainty. They forced enslavers to confront, even if they never admitted it, the reality that the people they oppressed were capable of striking back. Georgia's story doesn't offer the satisfaction of complete justice. She didn't escape to freedom. She didn't live to see slavery abolished. She didn't even get the recognition of having her full story preserved for history. What she got was a moment of power in a life defined by powerlessness. She got to watch the family suffer consequences for what they'd done to her and everyone like her. She got to know that her hands, which they'd used for their own purposes, had turned against them in a way they never saw coming. That's not redemption. That's not healing. That's just the cold, hard mathematics of resistance under impossible conditions. When you have no legal recourse, no protection, no acknowledgement of your humanity, revenge becomes one of the few ways to assert that you exist, that you matter, that you refuse to accept what's been done to you. Hit subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this, because history is full of them, hidden in the gaps where official records end and truth begins. The needle moved through linen with practiced silence, in and out, in and out. Somewhere in Tennessee in 1853, a woman named Georgia finished her work, folded the poisoned garments, and returned them to the people who thought they owned her. She moved through the big house like a ghost, invisible and essential, carrying with her a secret that would outlive everyone in that household. The family wore the clothes. The poison did its work. And Georgia, whether she lived or died, whether she was caught or remained hidden, had already won the only victory available to her. Proof that resistance was possible, that the system's control was never as complete as it pretended to be, that even hands forced to serve could find ways to strike back. Her story survives in fragments, passed down through communities who remembered what official history tried to forget. It survives in the fear that enslavers felt but never spoke about openly. It survives in the long record of people who refused to accept their own erasure, who fought back with whatever tools they had available, who proved that the human spirit could not be completely broken even under conditions designed to destroy it. Georgia sewed poison into clothing, and in doing so, she sewed her name into a history that continues to unfold. A history of resistance and survival, and the refusal to be rendered invisible. Her hands are still moving, even now. The needle still passes through fabric, and somewhere, in the gaps between what was documented and what actually happened, the truth remains. She struck back, and nothing was ever quite the same after.